I went to the park that morning because I needed quiet, not the dramatic kind of quiet that comes after something loud has happened, but the gentle, ordinary silence that exists when nothing is expected of you, when you can sit on a bench without a phone pressed to your ear, without a schedule dictating your next move, and without anyone demanding an explanation for simply existing in a public space. It was a weekday morning, the kind where most people were at work or school, leaving the park lightly populated with only a few joggers tracing the looping paths, a couple of elderly people sitting far apart on benches reading newspapers, and the usual scattered birds hopping around the grass with the cautious confidence that comes from years of being fed by strangers. I had stopped at a small bakery on my way there and bought a simple bread roll, nothing fancy, tearing it into small pieces as I sat down on my favorite bench, the one beneath a wide tree whose branches filtered the sunlight just enough to keep the heat comfortable. And as I tossed a few crumbs onto the ground, the pigeons approached slowly, bobbing their heads, retreating, then returning again as if negotiating with their own instincts. Feeding birds had become a quiet habit for me over time, not because I thought I was doing something especially meaningful, but because it forced me to slow down in a way that nothing else really did, to sit still, observe small movements, and let my thoughts settle without constantly chasing them. And for a while that morning, it worked exactly as intended. I had been sitting there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes when I noticed a woman walking down the paved path toward me, her pace brisk, her posture rigid, and her expression focused in a way that immediately felt out of place in such a relaxed environment, because she wasn't walking like someone enjoying the park, but like someone on a mission. At first, I paid her little attention, assuming she would pass by like everyone else. But as she drew closer, I could feel her gaze linger, not briefly, but with intent. And when I looked up, our eyes met for a split second before she slowed and stopped a few feet away from my bench, planting herself firmly as if she had decided this exact spot required her intervention. She stood there in silence long enough to make it uncomfortable, hands resting on her hips, eyes flicking between me and the birds gathered near my feet, her lips pressed together in a tight line. That suggested she had already formed an opinion and was merely deciding how to deliver it. "You shouldn't be doing that," she said finally, her voice flat and authoritative, as if she were correcting a child rather than addressing a stranger. I blinked, slightly caught off guard, and asked calmly, "Doing what?" She gestured sharply toward the birds, her fingers cutting through the air. "Feeding them, yes," I replied, glancing down at the crumbs in my hand. "I'm feeding birds." Her expression tightened immediately, as she shook her head as if deeply disappointed. "That's disgusting," she said. "It's unsanitary, and it attracts pests." I looked around instinctively, scanning the park for any posted signs that might support her claim, any indication that I was violating a rule I had somehow missed, but there was nothing. Just the same familiar park signs listing hours and reminding people to clean up after their dogs. "I've done this plenty of times," I said evenly. "There's no sign saying I can't." She let out an exaggerated sigh, the kind meant to communicate moral superiority, and said, "People like you are the reason public spaces get ruined." That was the moment I felt irritation rise, not because of what she said, but because of the certainty with which she said it. The assumption that her discomfort automatically translated into wrongdoing on my part. But rather than engage, I turned my attention back to the birds, hoping she would lose interest and move on. Instead, she stepped closer, narrowing the physical space between us, and raised her voice just enough to ensure it carried. "I'm talking to you," she said. "You can't just ignore me." I looked up again and replied calmly, "I'm sitting on a public bench, not bothering anyone." Her eyes widened slightly at that, and she pointed at the birds scattering and regrouping nearby. "You're bothering me." It became clear then that this wasn't about hygiene, or wildlife, or park etiquette, but about control, about her belief that public spaces should operate according to her personal comfort, and that anyone who violated those unspoken rules deserved to be confronted. "I'm not doing anything illegal," I said quietly, choosing my words carefully. That single word, illegal, seemed to trigger something in her, because without hesitation, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and said, "We'll see about that." At first, I assumed she was bluffing, maybe pretending to make a call to intimidate me. But when I heard her clearly say, "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious behavior in the park," my chest tightened. With disbelief, I stood slightly from the bench, incredulous, and asked, "Are you calling 911 because I'm feeding birds?" She looked at me with a smug expression, as if daring me to challenge her authority. "You're loitering," she said, and feeding wildlife can spread disease. Several people nearby slowed their movement, pretending not to stare while clearly listening, and I felt that familiar mix of embarrassment and frustration that comes when someone publicly frames you as a threat using vague language that sounds serious but means nothing concrete. I considered leaving because part of me just wanted the situation to end, but something about the way she spoke, the confidence with which she accused me, made me hesitate, because I didn't want it to look like I was running away from something I hadn't done. So instead, I sat back down on the bench, placed the remaining bread beside me, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. She continued pacing back and forth while talking loudly into her phone, describing me as refusing to leave, acting strangely, and lingering with animals, exaggerating every detail while I sat there in plain view, doing absolutely nothing. The park felt different then, heavier somehow, as if the presence of her accusations had altered the atmosphere, and even the birds seemed more cautious, fluttering away and returning in short bursts, after what felt like far longer than it probably was. A police cruiser rolled slowly along the park path, its tires crunching softly on the gravel, and 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area before the woman rushed toward them, waving her arms and speaking rapidly. "That's him," she said, pointing at me. "He's been sitting there forever feeding birds and refusing to stop." One of the officers turned to me with a calm expression and asked, "Sir, can you tell us what's going on?" I explained everything from the beginning: the bench, the bread, the brief conversation, and her decision to call 911, while the officers listened quietly, occasionally glancing at the birds pecking harmlessly at the grass. The second officer walked over to a nearby sign, read it carefully, then asked, "Are there any posted rules against feeding birds here?" Before I could respond, the woman jumped in. "It's common sense." The officer nodded politely and replied, "Common sense isn't a law." That simple statement seemed to deflate her, her confidence faltering as the officer explained that there was no violation, and that feeding birds was not a crime. "What is a problem?" he added calmly, "is calling 911 for something that isn't an emergency." The surrounding onlookers watched openly now, and for the first time since she arrived. The woman looked uncomfortable, her posture stiffening as the authority she expected to wield slipped away. The officers advised her to use non-emergency channels in the future, reminded her that public spaces are shared, and then turned to me and asked if I was okay, a small gesture that felt unexpectedly validating. When they left, the park slowly returned to its earlier rhythm, joggers resumed their pace, conversations resumed, and the birds cautiously returned to the bench. The woman stood there for a moment longer, clearly unsure of what to do now that her control had evaporated, then turned and walked away without another word. I sat there a while longer, finished feeding the birds, and reflected on how easily peace can be disrupted when someone mistakes discomfort for danger, realizing that sometimes simply existing calmly in a public space is enough to expose another person's need for control. That day reminded me that patience and quiet resistance can be more powerful than confrontation, and that sometimes the best response to entitlement is simply staying seated, feeding birds, and letting the truth speak for itself.